Okay, let's jump right in. What if there's a strand of DNA right here in Europe that seems to, well, defy all the usual stories we tell about race, migration, even identity?
Hmm.
Imagine a genetic signature that just doesn't quite fit the standard boxes.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it.
We're kind of informally calling it the Portuguese gene for this discussion. And today, we're doing a deep dive into why this whole idea is such a hotbed of fascination for geneticists, historians, sociologists, basically everyone looking at it.
Right. It really pulls people in.
Our mission really is to help you understand what makes this genetic signature so peculiar, so interesting.
Exactly. And we'll be looking at, the research, the scientific papers, historical accounts, trying to piece together what makes this specific genetic makeup so compelling. And sometimes pretty controversial, too.
Okay, so let's start by unpacking that uniqueness. Researchers talk about something genuinely distinct in the Iberian Peninsula's genes, especially in Portugal. It doesn't neatly slot into, say, Western European or Mediterranean or even North African categories like you might expect.
No, it doesn't. It stands apart. It seems to be older, for one thing, and much more diverse, more mixed than many neighboring populations.
And that resistance to easy labels, that's what's really striking, isn't it?
Precisely. And, for geneticists, that's not just a curiosity. It forces us to maybe rethink some of the traditional models of how populations moved and mixed in Europe.
Suggests a more complex
A
story.
much richer story, yeah. It hints that maybe those neat lines we draw on historical maps are a bit too simple.
So delving deeper then, what specific traces are we talking about?
Well, the findings point to North African markers, Jewish ancestry, specifically Sephardic, Sub-Saharan African links, even traces potentially linked to ancient Phoenicians.
Yeah, that's quite a mix.
It is. And the crucial part is the timescale. We're talking connections stretching back thousands of years, not just, a few centuries.
Thousands, so really deep roots.
Incredibly deep, which makes the Portuguese genome potentially one of the oldest layered genetic signatures in Europe. It's like a living record of ancient interactions.
I like that layered. One of the sources used this great analogy, like a cake.
Oh, the cake analogy, yeah.
Baked and rebaked, right?
Mhm.
Spiced and respiced with ingredients from, well, everyone who passed through. Moorish populations, Roman settlers, Celtic tribes, the Jewish diaspora, explorers.
All contributing to the mix over millennia.
And what gets me is how these genes seem to have persisted, almost silently, undisturbed, even through things like the Inquisition, mass expulsions, forced conversions, centuries of colonial activity. How does that happen? How does the genetic story survive when the historical narrative tries to erase it?
That's a fantastic question, and it speaks volumes, I think, about the sheer resilience of genetic heritage. It shows that even under immense pressure to conform or assimilate, these underlying genetic traces can endure.
Hidden sometimes, but still there.
Exactly. Hidden but detectable now with modern science. It really challenges our assumptions about how complete historical assimilation actually was.
Which leads us right into some sensitive areas, doesn't it? Our first, let's call it controversy alert. This hidden Jewish ancestry.
Mm-hmm. This Sephardic connection.
Historians are suggesting that potentially up to 20%, 1 in 5 modern Portuguese citizens, might have Sephardic Jewish roots. Lineage going back to Jewish communities who lived on the Iberian Peninsula for centuries.
And again, despite centuries of intense religious suppression, persecution, that genetic echo remains.
It's extraordinary. Families didn't talk about it for generations, obviously.
Yeah.
Too dangerous.
Understandably so. And some families still maintain that silence today. But now, with genetic testing becoming so widespread,
People are finding out.
people are finding out. They're uncovering these, hidden histories written in their blood. And it's fascinating, but also, well, not everyone's happy about it. It can be complicated.
I can only imagine the emotional weight of discovering something like that generations later.
Absolutely. And it's not just individuals. You have entire towns, communities, now tracing local Catholic traditions back to crypto-Jewish practices.
Crypto-Jewish, where Jewish beliefs and rituals were kept alive in secret behind a facade of Catholicism.
Precisely. Practiced in secret for generations to survive. So you have this cultural rediscovery happening alongside the genetic one.
Which poses a huge question then. If DNA reveals these long-buried truths, does it, or maybe should it, reshape how a nation sees itself?
Yeah.
Does it redefine what being Portuguese means?
That's the core of the debate, isn't it? How does a collective identity adapt to new information about its past, especially when that information complicates the standard narrative?
And that narrative gets even more complicated with the next point.
It does. Leading us to controversy alert number 2, the Sub-Saharan African influence and this idea of colonial amnesia.
Right, so scientists have found mitochondrial DNA links.
Which traces the direct maternal line, mother to daughter, way back.
Exactly. Links to Sub-Saharan Africa and a significant number of Portuguese women.
And it's important to stress these links aren't solely from the relatively recent Atlantic slave trade, though that's part of it. Some appear to be much older.
Older? How much older?
Potentially pointing back to earlier trans-Saharan interactions, centuries, maybe even millennia before the major European colonial period.
Okay, so that adds another really deep layer. But this is where the denial comes in.
This is where it gets contentious, yes.
Yeah.
There's resistance from some who insist on this idea of a pure Iberian or European lineage and who are uncomfortable acknowledging these African connections.
Kind of a willful blindness, maybe? Colonial amnesia, as you said.
Well, that's the term some scholars use because the genetics studies, consistently point towards this diversity. The argument from many researchers is that Portugal's huge colonial empire didn't just leave marks on other parts of the world.
It left marks back home, too.
Indelible genetic marks, yes.
Yeah.
It fundamentally challenges that idea of a single pure origin.
So what does that mean for a nation, especially one with such a prominent imperial history? To find out, its own DNA is actually far more mixed, far more global than the dominant story might suggest.
It forces a reckoning, I think.
Yeah.
A reckoning with history, with identity, with how tightly those two things are woven together, or how tightly we think they should be woven together. It reshapes the narrative fundamentally.
It really does. And this diversity hints at something else fascinating, too. Portugal's role in, ancient movements across the Atlantic.
Yes, the genetic bridge idea.
Explain that a bit, a genetic bridge.
Some scientists propose that Portugal, or the Iberian Peninsula more broadly, wasn't just a launching point for European exploration later on, but it might have served as a kind of crossroads, a genetic bridge connecting Africa, Europe, and maybe even the Americas, much earlier than we think.
Much earlier. You mean before Columbus?
That's the tantalizing possibility. There is evidence from prehistoric skeletons showing some unexpected genetic connections, and it fuels this ongoing debate. Could there have been ancient maritime links between places like the Canary Islands, the Iberian coast, maybe even across the Atlantic to the Caribbean?
Wow, okay. Predating Columbus. That would change everything.
It would rewrite a huge chunk of history, wouldn't it? The idea of transatlantic contact before 1492 is still debated, of course, highly debated. But the genetic clues from places like Portugal add intriguing pieces to that puzzle.
So just imagine that for a second. What if the Portuguese weren't just the later colonizers we read about, but also descendants of people who are navigating these Atlantic corridors, moving between continents, long before the history books even stole that chapter?
It's a mind-bending thought. It reframes them not just as initiators of a certain era of exploration, but perhaps as inheritors of a much older tradition of maritime movement.
Part of a longer, deeper Atlantic story.
Exactly. It paints a picture of Portugal not just on the edge of Europe, but maybe as a central hub in a very ancient network of human movement and exchange. Much more complex than we usually imagine.
Okay, this is incredibly rich. So let's try and distill this for everyone listening. What really makes this Portuguese gene, this genetic signature, so special? Let's recap the key points.
Okay, first, it's ancient, really ancient. It holds traces from almost every major migration wave that swept through Europe and beyond, going back thousands of years.
Right, ancient. Second.
It's incredibly diverse. You've got this blend, this mosaic of genetic input from North Africans, Moors, Jewish communities, Celts, Romans, Sub-Saharan Africans, maybe Phoenicians. It's a remarkable mix.
Diverse. Got it. Third point.
It's definitely controversial, no doubt about
Subjugating?
that. It directly challenges those neat nationalistic ideas about ethnic or racial purity, and it raises some really difficult but important questions about identity, about ancestry, about hidden histories.
Controversial. Okay.
Yeah.
And finally.
Finally, it's global. The story doesn't stop at Portugal's borders. It connects outwards, linking Portugal's genetic narrative to places touched by its history. Brazil, Angola, Goa, Macau, Mozambique. It shows how Portuguese genes traveled, mixed, and were transformed across the world.
Ancient, diverse, controversial, and global. That sums it up pretty well.
I think so. It covers the main dimensions.
So as we wrap up, let me just leave you our listener, with a few thoughts to mull over.
Mm-hmm.
If DNA can bring these long-hidden truths bubbling to the surface, should it actually rewrite our history books? How much weight should we give it?
Mm-hmm.
And where should national identity really come from? Is it about what's literally in our blood, our genetic code? Or is it more about our shared stories, our culture, the experiences we build together?
Deep questions.
They are. And maybe a more personal one. If you took an ancestry test and it came back saying you were, say, part Portuguese, with all this complexity we've just discussed,
Yeah.
would that change how you see yourself or how you see Portugal?
Because ultimately genetics, well, that's science, isn't it? It gives us data, powerful clues. But identity, that feels like something different. That feels like a story that maybe we're all still writing and definitely still discovering.